So my name is Sika Dagbovie Mullins. I'm a professor at Florida Atlantic University, and I have the pleasure of talking with Jabari Asim, Emily Raboteau, and Deesha Philyaw this morning. And the title of this panel is Young Reader's Guide to Black Literature. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Given the title, I want to start off by asking you to go back to your childhood or adolescence for a moment, and perhaps share with us a particular text that resonated with you as a young person, and maybe you can tell a little bit about why a text and why. Thank you.
Okay. Is there a particular...
You're looking at you.
Oh.
No pressure.
No, it's a complicated question because I think the first books I encountered that appealed to me as a young black reader typically were featured black characters, but weren't necessarily written by black authors, right? So I remember first grade, I fell in with a book called Two as a Team by Gerald Bain, which was about a friendship between a black boy and a white boy. This is, I don't know, 67, 68, so, you know, it was a while ago. And then around the same time, there was another book came out, and it was called, Oh, Lord, I Wish I Was a Buzzard. And it was by Polly Greenberg. And I remember my first grade teacher read it to us. It was all black school, black teacher. And, you know, we all just kind of fell in love with that book. It was about a little black girl and her family who were actually sharecroppers. And it was really sensitively done, right? And so I think those were probably the earliest books where, I don't want to say I got excited about it, but I got really drawn into it in a way that made me hunger for more, you know? So those were probably the earliest texts for me.
For me, two texts come to mind with that question, and I grew up as a mixed-race kid in the 80s, and my mother gave me a book called All the Colors of the Race. It was illustrated by John Steptoe, really beautiful illustrations. It was like free verse poems. I can't remember the author. I just remember the illustrator, and I know why my mom picked the book, because the girl on the cover looked like me. I recently came across my copy of that book. It's probably out of print in my mother's house, and I had this like great rush of affection for it, because I remember really appreciating as a child seeing a degree of representation. But I had a different feeling about the text as an adult. It felt kind of ham-fisted to me, because it really made a point of like, it was kind of corny. Like my father is chocolate and my mother is vanilla, and I'm the swirly sweetness or something like that. It was kind of cheesy, but I think, you know, as I'm sure we'll talk about more, it's particularly important for children to see visual representations of themselves. So that book mattered to me as a girl. And then another that my father gave me and my brothers was The People Could Fly, illustrated by Leo and Diane Dillon. Beautiful illustrations. And I think that was black folk tales that were narrated to, I think it was Virginia Hamilton.
Yeah.
And they're short, you know, but you could just appreciate the richness of the text and the beauty of the imagery, which, you know, The People Could Fly. Just remember, it's the cover image, and it's inside to enslaved peoples flying as a way of getting free, and it's you know, like a metaphor for death, or like breaking the chains in this way. But I read that at a young enough age that I really believed the people could fly. You know, like I believed that the way that it was told. I loved that book, and my children have that book on their shelf now.
That cover is gorgeous. I can just see the blue sky,
Yes.
right, and the enslaved folks who are right on their way back home.
Yeah.
So I have a couple. The first book I ever loved was There's a Monster at the End of This Book by Lovable Furry Old Grover. I read that book, and this is the theme. I would read books as a kid until they literally fell apart. And I remember finding that old copy. And in books that I love, I would reread. And so that was part of my pattern, is reading the same book over and over again. And then the next book I remember loving is Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing by Judy Blume. That one also, I may still have my original copy. It was falling apart, and there's staples and tape, but I just love the stories, and I love Peter. And then I think my first really big YA book was Daddy Was a Number Runner by Louise Merriweather. And you were talking about representation, and even though Francie Coffin lived in New York in the 1930s, and I was living in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was 10 the first time I read the book, I still felt like I saw myself. Like, here was a girl whose family struggled and dealt with poverty, and in a community where there was crime, but there was also a lot of love, but there was also a lot of danger, and just sort of the complexity of her life. That really resonated with me. And I also learned a lot of history from that book. There's a lot of American history in Daddy Was a Number Runner.
It's so interesting, the books that stand the test of time, and then the others that you return to, like you mentioned, that like, oh, okay, maybe it was just a particular moment, because I was thinking about one book that I still have is The Tales of Babar, but I have like a really original copy that's like, portrays Africans as Sambos, and and I'm thinking, why do I have this? What, I'm like, my name is scribbled all over it, right? I have this like nostalgia, but then when you go back, it can be something quite different, right?
Yes, yes.
So the three of you have all written narratives from the perspective of young people, right? Particularly young people who face either painful or difficult or very like adult issues kind of before their time. And so since we're thinking about young readers here, I thought it might be fitting to think about your young characters for a moment. And so I'm thinking there's an array, but Emma in The Professor's Daughter, and Deesha, your peach cobbler, Olivia, or JL, right? And Jabari, I just reread your collection. I was thinking about I'd Rather Go Blind. I know it's from a while ago, but Bean Shot's character, right, who has to
Yes.
reconcile with death, or the death of that store owner. And so I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the process of constructing an adolescent voice, like as an adult. How do you do that?
For me, it's those two characters in particular, but also other characters that I'm currently writing who I always make them the age, whatever age I was in that year, so that's, I guess, a bit of a cheat. But I feel like the reason I do that is because these characters say and do things that I didn't say and do when I was in those situations, that sometimes I wish I could have done or said. And sometimes I'm writing what really happened, and sometimes I'm writing what I wish had happened instead. And so I find it actually easier to write those characters than adult characters, because I think young me has been wanting for so long to say some of these things. It's like talking back. Yeah. And so that's how I get into those characters. I haven't had the experience yet of writing a child set in the present, and I think that would just completely confound me. But if they're children, then if they're preteens, we're looking at late 70s, early 80s, and so there's this nostalgia that comes, and I just sort of fall into that world. And then if they're teenagers, we're looking at into the 80s, and there's a lot of cultural stuff that comes up, and it feels almost like a cheat, those stories, because it's what I want to be writing about the most.
Yeah.
I think I would have a harder time now at age 46 writing from the perspective of youth or childhood. For my novel, my first novel, The Professor's Daughter, the narrator, Emma, it is sort of a proxy for myself, as in a lot of people's first novels. It's a coming-of-age story about a girl who shares more or less my biography. Yeah. That is, she's a mixed-race girl who grew up in the 80s, and I think I undertook to write, perhaps because all the colors of the race book I just described, returning to and feeling kind of schlocky, it's because I think this is a condition, maybe you agree, Sika, there's often or there was at a certain point, if your parents met in, say, the 60s, 70s, there was a way in which I think your body was meant to represent civil rights, or like there's some way in which your body is supposed to represent some kind of coming together. And I wanted to explore the problem of that with the book, but also to answer more fully a question I've been asked my entire life, which is, what are you? It's actually a rude question when you consider the microaggression of how often it gets asked. But I wanted to undertake that question in a more than skin deep way, and so I like spent a novel doing it. But I also, I think I was closer to the age of youth. That narrator, the book spans, her like childhood through early adulthood. And I don't think I could access her voice in the same way now that I'm middle-aged as I could when I was writing that book in my 20s. Like I could still access those memories and that experience of what it was to be an uncomfortable teenager. And now I don't reach for that in the same way any longer. But I think I could access as a mother like the perspective of a younger child. But of course, my children's experiences are quite different from mine. So.
Right. Yeah.
You anticipated the question I had for you before I answer. I was just going to say, but I wonder, Emily, about you're also a mom and but you anticipated that. So it's an altered perspective because they're in a different time span, I guess, right? Yeah. My first book was a novel for middle schoolers called The Road to Freedom, and it featured a boy named Ezra, who I think is 10 at the beginning of the story and is 12 at the end. And I guess a couple of things influenced me. It's really about his relationship with his father. My relationship with my father is sort of a central vector through which a lot of my literary experiences flow. So I was very sensitive. One thing I'm really sensitive about in writing young characters of color is inspired in part also by conversations I've had with editors in the course of creating characters. I've gotten pushback more often than I'd like from editors questioning the precocity of the children. Well, would a 10-year-old black boy know this word? Would he express himself this way, et cetera? What about a 5-year-old? So it's kind of a conversation I'm accustomed to having, but it's one that I'm very sensitive about, right? Sure. Because I grew up in an all-black community, surrounded by children like myself, and a number of those children were absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And I still marvel today, many years later, at the insights that they had, right? So on a certain level, I always want to be faithful to the intelligence of the children that I knew and the children that I continue to know. And I know my wife, for a long time was a professional storyteller and a children's librarian. And so we would have these conversations about the young characters we were encountered in books, and also how young readers of color responded to those characters. And it's often with a degree of insight and muscular intellect in a way that's not acknowledged, right, in our community. So I always want to be sensitive to that, and I always kind of push back and say, well, yeah, I knew lots of 10-year-old black girls, black boys who knew those words or who expressed their emotions this way. So I think that's one of the things that I'm always thinking about when I'm writing. I want to be faithful to genuine feeling, but I also want to be very respectful of young intellect.
Right.
And so that also motivates me.
That kind of reminds me of, discussions. If folks were at the conversation with Nadej Green and Ashley Ford earlier, and we're kind of talking about representations of black youth. And she was talking about the very short span that black girls get to be girls. And I'm just thinking about like representations of black youth, right? That we're not afforded innocence. We can't really be children, right? Or even like intellectual, as you're saying, right? And so I'm wondering, if and how maybe you think about that in your works, like the fact that in popular culture and in media representations, black children can't just be children, right? I think about even in your short story, one of your short stories, Deesha and JL, like Cashel, right, is I don't want to say stalked, but she is...
She's preyed upon.
That's what I was going to say. There's a predator, right, who reads her body and reads her as much older than she is, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, sadly, I don't know that he reads her as much older than he is. Unfortunately, he reads her as exactly 15 years old. I mean, she lies about her age. She's, 14, but he thinks she's 15. But because he's a predator, that's fine with him. For me, the question of representation comes when we have the problem of, predatory behavior. We have the adultification of Black girls, where studies have shown that adults of all races look at Black girls ages starting as early as 5 as adults and ascribe adult characteristics and behavior to them, sexualizing them, and those sorts of things. And so for me, I had people ask the question, did I worry about writing a story in which young girls not being preyed upon, but in sort of their own Jael, not Cashel, being, a sexual being, having fantasies about the preacher's wife, wondering about, sex and heaven. Can you get into heaven if you do certain sexual acts? Was I then over-sexualizing Black girls? And my answer was no. I mean, I don't, other people can disagree, but I didn't see it as sexualizing her as much as it was putting on the page what I knew to be real questions that Black girls grapple with and real things that Black girls feel that were internal, of course, driven by external forces, but that Jael, this was a character who had such self-possession at a young age. And these were things in her diary. Now her privacy was being violated, but these are things that she wrote in her diary. And so I think it can be tricky. There's a certain nuance there, but I think if we love Black people, we're gonna do right by Black characters, and I just trusted myself to do that, knowing that not everybody would be okay with it, but I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, I think all of you on stage are parents, right? And I'm curious, since we're thinking about young readers, are you raising, young readers? Is there some reticence? Can you talk about maybe, I know there's probably an age span here, but what your kids did read or what they are reading, or what it means to read? I have a 10-year-old daughter who's super into graphic novels. I'm curious about your own kids.
I have a 9 and 11-year-old, so just flanking yours in age.
Yeah.
And my husband is also a writer, Victor Laval. Some of you have seen him on other panels here this weekend, and so perhaps unsurprisingly, we're raising 2 strong readers. And I love that 2 of the other writers here, Jabari and Jackie Woodson, are authors that have been very important to our children. But because you were talking about innocence with the last question, it reminded me of one book I love for its innocence and its depiction of a Black child in an innocent way. I think we all love this book. Is The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats. Again, not a Black author illustrator, but captured something so sweet in that book. Just a child reveling in snow. And also for my kids who, we're bringing them up in New York City, seeing an urban environment, not in a pathologized way, but in a magical way in that book. It's just this little Black boy in the red snowsuit. He brings home a snowball, and it wants to give it to his mother, I think, and it is melted, of course, by the end of the day.
Yeah.
And Peter's Chair by the same author.
Yes.
Just beautiful depictions of innocence that mattered to my kids, and I loved reading to them.
Yeah.
My kids my wife and I, we have 5 children. They're all grown now, but we have 2 grandgirls, 9 and 11, and I think one of my recent children's books, maybe two of my recent children's books are actually dedicated to them. But the early children's books that I created arose out of experiences in which I'm trying to entertain my children. You know, it's like when they're really small, how do you get them to take a nap? How do you get them to take a bath? All these things. So I would make up nonsense rhymes, you know, and I would recite them to them before they would go to bed or do whatever task that we needed them to do. And it was my wife who said, you know, you should probably just write those down and see and see if they can become something else. And so they arose out of parenting experiences. But as for books written by others, we were really into books by Patricia and Fred McKissick. They wrote a number of Flossie and the Fox, Mirandy and Brother Wind. We were into Virginia Hamilton quite a bit, Leo and Diane Dillon, Wade Hudson and Cheryl Willis Hudson of Just Us Books. Just a lot of really wonderful. They were really fortunate to be growing up in a period in which there was this this flowering of books in which children like them were not only represented, but were often the fruit of the imaginations of authors and illustrators who also look like them. So a lot of really wonderful, just a bountiful supply of books to choose from. But those were the authors that I think they appreciated as readers and whom I appreciated as a parent.
Yeah, thanks.
So my daughters are 19 and 24. And I, was always a voracious reader, and I thought, my children have to read. So, you're reading when they're in utero, reading all the time. They're surrounded by books. They're surrounded by books by and about Black people that celebrate Black children, as you said. And my kids were those kids in the restaurant where the waiters would be like, oh, they're reading the whole time, and I was so proud. And then when they got of an age to read, to choose their own books, they did not want to read the books that I wanted them to read, and I was devastated. But then I had to remember it's important that they are readers first. But they ventured into a lot of science fiction and speculative fiction, and not always by Black authors, not even primarily by Black authors. And I kept those in the house. I'm like, you're killing me right now. Graphic novels, not always about Black people, and it's not that they were avoiding them. They just, read very broadly, and their tastes were their tastes. And I remember my oldest daughter, Taylor, she really loved a Red Wall series, because we started doing that as kind of read aloud. And then Peyton, who's 19 now, Mo Willems with the Thick Black Moo.
Yeah.
She Mo Willems was her favorite author for the longest time. So, that was part of just parenting too. Is your children are their own people, including they are the readers. Who they become as readers. That's some self-possession. So.
You reminded me, Deesha. They're their own readers, but they also have different insights about some of the books I remember reading as kids. Like, I just read Geronimo. He's my 11-year-old. I just read him The Secret Garden. Read it to him at night, and sort of towards the beginning of the book, he goes, "Mom, this is kind of racist, isn't it?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, some of this language, some of this depiction is, but I want to get through it anyway. We can talk about that." But that wasn't. I didn't have that language for it when I read that book as a child. Like, I didn't have the same interpretation that he had of the way that Indian characters were being portrayed in the beginning of that book. So, they have a different language with which to understand books than I remember having.
And that's just like to go back to your comment about like you wanting them to read certain, texts, that tension, parenting just in general, whether it's about books or anything, right?
Yeah.
Like, where do you, how much do you kind
Choose
of
your battles,
and let them, yes. But I remember like how happy I was when we were at the bookstore and, I said, pick whatever you want to my daughter, and she brought this, it's a book, it's a graphic novel, YA, it's entitled Frizzy. I'm forgetting the name of the author, but she's Afro-Dominican, and it's all about hair and the politics of hair. And I'm like, yes, right? Because we know, we want them to love how they look and their hair and all of its beautiful natural state.
That's right.
And so, how happy secretly, I was like, yes, yeah.
Fortunately, in college, my oldest daughter was introduced to books that I had been trying to get her to read for years. And she would text me and, something about this Toni Morrison book and, there was the part of me that's like, I told you so. But I didn't say that. I was just happy that she, had professors who were, reintroducing her to that literature that I had tried to introduce her to.
Speaking of hair, when you mentioned frizzy, I just remembered a book I loved reading to my younger child, I Like Myself, by Karen Beaumont. It depicts a child with like wild hair. And it's just, the words are so great. I like myself. I'm glad I'm me. There's no one else I'd rather be. I like my eyes, my ears, my nose. I like my fingers and my toes. And goes on. But it's so joyful, and it's about self-love, but not in a way that's, not in a way that feels like medicine. It's just a child getting to be a child.
Yeah.
Like reveling in their wild body and wild hair. Yeah.
Yeah, we have that one. That's a good one.
Did you all read with your kids Shades of Black?
Yeah. Yes, isn't
That board book?
all pictures?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? Each, a little board book.
Yes, and it talked
have
about
that.
different haircut textures and skin colors and likened it. I mean, and it was likening it to food, but not in a creepy, disturbing kind of way.
We're always food, aren't? It's always like, right?
But it's like, I feel like that book kind of reclaimed that practice because they had actual children, who did, you could see the ginger hair and things like that. So.
Yeah. Well, I know we have, or I imagine that we have like maybe some teachers here, librarians. I know earlier there were some high school students. And so maybe before we get to a Q&A, I'm wondering if there's if you can name a work that you might recommend to a teenager. I'm sure there's tons, but does one immediately come to mind right when you're asked that question?
I always freeze up. So
I have one because it's probably the most recent YA that I've read. And I think it came out last year, and it's called Confessions of an Alleged Good Girl by Joya Gaffney, I think is her last name. And it's her second book, and she's in her early 20s, and she's just an amazing writer. But this is the kind of book that I wish that I had as a teenager, because I read, like I was reading like Portnoy's Complaint when I was a kid. Like, no, that should not be happening. But we needed some YA that featured Black girls that dared to talk about sex in ways that challenged taboos, that challenged binaries, that challenged double standards and all that. And that's what this book does. And the main character is the 17-year-old daughter of a Baptist pastor in a small Texas town, Black family. And she's been dating the star of the basketball team for years, and everybody thinks they're gonna get married. And the two of them decide that because they're gonna get married, it's okay if they have sex. Of course, they don't tell anyone, but they've tried, when the story opens, they've tried 29 times and they can't. And it turns out she has a medical condition that she's been too ashamed, obviously, she doesn't want to talk about because of shame and fear. And so the book is all about confronting that shame and fear, confronting our assumptions and our misconceptions and all of those double standards. And it's just one of the most sex-positive books I've ever read.
The book that came to mind for me is Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor.
Oh, yeah.
That was a book that mattered to me a lot at 13 and that I continue to give kids around that age range. For me, my dad, there was kind of a quietness in our household about racial terror that had affected his family. And when I read that book, it explained a lot, kind of learn a lot about history and its residue on national and family level and personal levels. Beautifully written, beautiful book.
I can think of a couple. Whenever I'm asked that question, my brain cramps immediately. But one is a book called Tinfoil Crowns by Erin Jones, and it's about a teenage girl who is developed an internet presence. She's very savvy in terms of being an internet creator, and she's created this public persona for herself. But the complication in her life is that her mother is incarcerated and is about to return home, and so she has to readjust to that. And the other is called The Finch House by Sierra Birch, which has yet to be published, but I've had the privilege of being familiar with the material before it comes out. And I think Sierra Birch is a young African-American writer who's about to become very well known in that particular area. And her books explore sexuality, gender identification, and also have a strong suspense element. So that's one that I would recommend that we look for in the coming months.
Thank you. I like to throw in Vanita Blackburn's How to Wrestle a Girl.
Yes.
Which I think would be so great for teenagers. I mean, it's a teenage protagonist and written in a really interesting way, diaries and an interesting collection. So, all right. So I think we have some time for a Q&A that we can open up now.
Please stand if you have a question. We'll bring the microphone to you.
Hi, sorry. I was wondering, will you or have you let your children read the things you've written, and is that important to you, or do you just not want them to do that at all?
So, yes, I thought my daughters weren't going to read my book, actually, and it's because some years ago, not long before it came out, when my oldest daughter was 16, she went with me to a reading, and I read something that's not in my book, but it's a short story, and it's about a 14-year-old girl, and it had some sexual content, and when I got on the stage, I said something like, part of this story, this is semi-autobiographical. And then years later, my daughter told me that I violated her boundaries by subjecting her to a story that was semi-autobiographical and leaving her to kind of imagine which parts were real and not. So when my book came out, and my book is dedicated to both of my daughters, and I gave them both copies, and I just didn't say anything. And then, because I don't know about y'all, but your kids are just never impressed by the things you do until when you say that, they're like, no, we totally support you. So they didn't tell me that they had read it, so I assumed that they hadn't. And then one day we were sitting around talking, and my oldest daughter, who I thought if anybody read it, it would be my younger daughter. But Taylor said, "Oh, that's like when your character is something, something." And I said, "You read my book?" And she was like, "Of course I read your book." And that's, and so I wanted them to, but I didn't want to be accused of, violating anyone's boundaries. So I let them see. They can find the work if they want it.
I look forward to the day when my kids, are old enough to be able to read my books if they choose to, and I hope they will, because I think it'll give them a deeper understanding of an appreciation of their mom as somebody other than just their mom.
Yes. Yes.
Which at this stage, I think they know I'm a writer, but the content, like the diction is too high for them. But that won't always be the case, and I hope when they do read it, they'll have a different kind of understanding of who I am and the way that I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the children's books I did kind of place in their hands and sometimes read to them, and of course they bore witness to multiple drafts of a lot of the projects. The books that I've written for adults, I've been less hands-on. It's like it's probably similar to Deesha. I leave them around for and I know that some of them have read them, and some of them, if they haven't indicated it, right? But I have a couple of my sons are very serious writers, and I know they read them with highlighters and marginalia and critiques, and so I get it from them. It's constructive. I mean, they're adults now. We can have that conversation, right? But it's a mixed bag. But with the adult stuff, I'm much less. I kind of like. When I get the advanced readers copies, I will sign one for each of them and leave it there. That's the end of the discussion. They can put it on the shelf and let it collect dust, or maybe they're reading them. Who knows?
When I was a child back in the late 1930s, I was given a book called Little Black Sambo, which I think was a classic book at the time, or considered classic. And it just popped into my head, and I have no idea what it was about. Is that a racist book?
Yes.
Yes.
What?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
So is the restaurant by the same name.
Yeah, so there are a whole slew of racist children's books that.
Here, hold on 1 second. Bringing you a live one.
So I want to throw out, oh, there you go. I want to throw out the topic of open AI as it relates to young readers and writers. I'm an educator here in Monroe County, and we're having lots of conversation around ChatGPT and these kind of things. So as I go to the table with these conversations, I'd like to get some talking points from you, how it may impact your industry, but more importantly, a reader and young writer.
And I'm sorry, can you repeat? You said the chat. I might need an explanation of that.
Artificial intelligence.
Yes, yes. You mentioned something else after that. I'm sorry.
ChatGPT.
Oh,
Yeah.
ChatGPT. Okay, I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
I'm still very much educating myself about it. Like, there's a piece going around by a professor who said, you know, I detected the use of AI in the paper, and you know, this is alarming. But then I've since read an article about a student who has developed software that detects the use of ChatGPT, and you can put it. But in a nutshell, it's artificial intelligence that enables you to create not just nonfiction, but short stories and poems and things like that. And how will we as educators be able to detect that and assess it? It's a really good question. I don't know if anyone has the answer. I'll tell you the most recent. I'm in these different chat groups, right, on the internet, and one of my colleagues, whom I respect, who talks a lot about AI, says instead of fearing it and warning students against it, and this is just one opinion, but I respect his. He said, let's try to frame it as a useful tool in certain aspects of creative writing, but not in the imaginative aspect, that it can be used in these other formats or other usages, and that we shouldn't be so alarmist in saying that it's absolutely going to take over imaginations and fool educators, et cetera. But I'm very much at that minimal level where I'm just learning. I'm really paying attention to people who know more about it than me and kind of reading the different responses. That's where I am with it.
Yeah. I'm still learning too.
Yeah.
And you just gave me a lot more information than I previously had. But I'm thinking about a question I asked of another panel that was up here the other night, and it was about, my question was about play in writing and joy in writing. And so I think part of it is we have the technology on one side, and we have to address those issues and ethical issues and things like plagiarism. But on the other side, I think our job as parents and teachers and people who want young people to love literature is to make sure that when we are engaging them, it's a joyful experience, it's a playful experience. I think we do, I'll speak for, you know, when I was in school, there was so much done that undermined reading for pleasure, writing for pleasure, the joy and the play and all of those things that can't be 100% replicated by technology. And so so I think we are also coming at it from that place. And maybe that's a little naive on my part, that we can, you know, maybe it's a little touchy-feely, but that's my thought about it.
I think it's a good point. Even, you know, the classes that I teach, sometimes I think you get into this kind of giving an assignment because you need to give an assignment, rather than like, why am I signing this, right? Why am I signing this particular paper to have them do this, right? Because when they feel forced into doing something just for the sake of doing it, right, then they'll be more, you know, swayed into, right, using other, you know, devices and such to help them. So I think that's connected to this idea of, like, you know, not to be idealistic, but yeah, joy in, right, in reading and writing.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I have a question about censorship and what we should we, of course, I don't believe that we should, but I did when my children were small, censor some books from Black readers. I work at a bookstore that, You know, Judy Blume is all about putting banned books out there. And not just for racial content, but when my son was young, I didn't want him to read The Color Purple when he was 13. I thought it was too much. I gave him no credit. Are there books that you think have gotten a bad rap that are now, it's a big topic, but some books that you might not have wanted your children to read at a young age?
I don't think there was anything. I remember before I had kids, I went to someone's house who did have kids, and their policy was if they can reach it, they can read it. And so if there was anything they didn't want their children to read, they just didn't have it out on the bookshelf, or they had it, high enough. And so I think that was my attitude. I never hid any of the books that I was reading, that were very much adult books. And I just would always tell my kids, if you read something in a book and it confuses you or scares you, let's talk about it. That's what books are for, to have conversations and to help give us ideas that we may not have otherwise have gotten. And so, I don't think there was anything that I felt like they weren't ready for. I just felt like they would have questions if it was confusing. I don't know.
I like that, Deesha, like encouraging a child if they encounter something that feels confusing or scary to just invite them to talk about it with you. I think I'll steal that as a parent, because both my kids learned to read quite a young age, and they're still young, but sometimes it's like their reading level is beyond, I would say, in terms of at least sexual content and things that I think that are like maybe too scary. I don't want to censor them, but there's some things that I think are too advanced for them to read. It's tricky because I'm married to a horror writer, and your children are very interested in things that are scary, but there's some movies I wouldn't want them to see yet because it would destroy their sleep. I feel there are some books that are also too scary, even though they could understand them, like sentence, word to word and sentence to sentence. I think their imaginations are still so elastic that they might not understand this isn't real. And I don't want them not sleeping at night.
I think you have to be really sensitively, as much as possible, attuned to the individual child. I was a precocious reader, and eventually, of course, I got really bored with the literature that was designed for people my age, and my parents kind of discouraged me from looking at their very adult books, right? Because there are a lot of books in the house. But I'm eternally grateful to my sister. When I was maybe about 11 years old, she gave me a novel that she had read. It was a thriller. It was called The Chancellor Manuscript. I can't remember who the author was. And, she handed it to me. She said, I've been watching you. I know you're really bored with the stuff that, you're being handed. She said, this book has some sex in it, but I think you can handle it. Right? She said that to me, and I felt very mature, right? It's like, I'm having this very mature discussion with my older sister, right? And said this, and I felt kind of honored, right? But it also made me think, whatever's in here, I'm going to handle it, right? I want to be sure I can handle it. And she was right. It was fine, but it was sort of a breakthrough, and I think my parents were observing that and saying, well, he did okay with that. Let's be a little more relaxed about what he reads. Whether that would apply to, I'm one of 6, whether that would apply to all of my siblings, maybe not, right? But they had enough time and attention for me where they could make a decision based on where I was.
Sika, there was actually a young person that had a question, and I don't think we can have a young person's panel and not have their question.
Yeah. Can we sneak in one quick more question?
Right in the front. Sorry.
No worries about it.
Thank you. Oh, that is weird. Hi. So you've been talking a lot about, I guess, readers in their formative years, and I think, at least for me, and I know a lot of my other friends, when you're kind of in those years, there's often kind of something you read or you watch that really clicks, like, I want to do this. Like, you watch something, you read something, and it's like, I can do this, I want to do this, I'm going to start writing, I'm going to start making something with my hands. And I wanted to ask, I guess, just to all of you, Was there like a really formative like book or movie or just any piece of media, I guess, you watched, and in that moment you knew you wanted to do writing?
Oddly enough, it was Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. There was just something about, reading about church. And I remember specifically scenes of, spiritual ecstasy in the book. And I remember thinking, I want to do that. I want to write stories where you could see the people dancing. I remember having that thought.
For me, it was probably the Anne of Green Gables series. Just like she was such a spirited girl, and I felt totally immersed in that whole series. Like sad when I came to its end, and I felt like transported in time. And I think that was like the beginnings of the inklings of me wanting to be a writer too. I don't know if it was because of those books, but I loved the feeling of being so saturated in Anne's story.
I think for me it was a couple of collections of short stories by Alice Walker, including Love and Trouble, You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down. I had been reading a lot of fiction and enjoying all of it, very much as a reader. But I think those were like the first stories where I began to kind of like see inside them and see the anatomy, right? And go, oh, I see what she did there. I see how she put that together. I see the decision she made right there. And I'm admiring all of this, and I thought, okay, I'm seeing the undercarriage of the story as a vehicle, and I thought, okay, maybe, if I start doing this, I can almost sort of emulate some of the things that are being done here. So it was probably those stories.
I think we're out of time, but thanks so much for joining us.